On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the DPRK's weekend missile tests and worries over food security. What now for Korean Peninsula diplomacy? And green is in at the recently opened Beijing Horticultural Expo. Stories of nature's beauty and bounty.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Last year, DPRK leader Kim Jong Un pledged to stop testing nuclear bombs and long-range ballistic missiles. On Saturday, multiple missiles have been launched from the DPRK into the East Sea. Analysts suspect they were short-range missiles, so not technically in breach of Kim Jong Un's pledge, but definitely intended to test Washington's negotiating position after President Trump walked away from what he described as a bad deal at his Hanoi summit with Kim Jong Un in February. For more, let's take a look.
The DPRK test-fired several missiles on Saturday. The launch happened amid stalled negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington. But the U.S. president insists the two sides will reach an agreement. On social media, Mr. Trump played down the test, saying, "I believe that Kim Jong Un fully realizes the great economic potential of North Korea and will do nothing to interfere or end it." The White House says it is following Pyongyang's actions and will monitor the situation. Meanwhile, Japan's Foreign Minister Taro Kono spoke on the phone with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Japan says the DPRK's projectiles didn't pose a threat. South Korea had been keen on easing financial restrictions on the DPRK, but struck a tougher tone the day before the launch.
The logic is very clear. The sanctions are there because of North Korea's nuclear and missiles program, and therefore there has to be some visible, concrete, substantial action on that track for the global community to do anything about the sanctions.
Nuclear diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula has been in limbo ever since Mr. Trump walked away from what he described as a bad deal at his Hanoi summit with Kim Jong Un in February. The DPRK leader and Russian President Vladimir Putin recently discussed reviving the long-stalled six-party talks that include Russia and China, though the U.S. has ruled that out. The only thing that's clear is that the DPRK needs money, and fast. The United Nations released a report on Friday warning the DPRK has cut food rations to their lowest level ever for this time of year and may be forced to further slash them without international aid.
It is estimated that about 10.1 million people, around 40% of the population, are considered to be food insecure and in need of urgent food assistance.
The UN says the severe food shortages follow what its key food agencies describe as the worst harvest in a decade. U.S. Special Representative for the DPRK, Stephen Biegun, will travel to South Korea and Japan next week for talks aimed at finding a way to break the nuclear diplomacy deadlock.
So, what would it take to break the nuclear diplomacy deadlock on the Korean Peninsula? Let's turn to our panelists. In Washington, D.C., Jenny Tang, a research analyst at the STIMSON Center and the managing editor at 38 North. Welcome, ma'am. In Boston, Dr. Jim Walsh, a senior research associate at MIT's Security Studies program. Good to see you, sir. And last but not least, in Beijing, XIYU, Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. It's good to have the three of you who are experts on the issue. Start with you, Ms. Tang. You've been doing research about the DPRK for a long time, doing exclusive projects about what's going on inside the country. What do you make as a mixed picture? On the one hand, the launch, the test, on the other, the drought, and also the food security issue?
Well, I think we have to be a little bit careful of how we portray the test that happened over the weekend. A lot of talk is about how it's sending signals to Washington And in fact, the North Koreans had warned ahead of time that this was really a possibility, these type of reciprocal measures that are geared towards Seoul. And again, still trying to push Moon Jae-in to be able to maneuver, to be able to bring about better results in the inter-Korean agenda, which has been stalled, largely because of a lack of cooperation from Washington. But this puts South Korea in a very difficult position as to how do they respond going forward, since they have not gotten cooperation from the U.S. on either the peace agenda or the economic agenda to be able to make good on their half of the commitments in the inter-Korean accords.
Right.
It's always unfortunate as a result of sanctions, as a result of the dwindling trade and the dwindling business, that it makes it more difficult for the most vulnerable populations in North Korea to have food security, because a lot of where they were getting food before was not always based on the harvest itself, but they had been importing a lot of foodstuffs, and people were able to purchase the foods within the markets. And so, the effects that sanctions are having are affecting the most vulnerable populations first, way before anyone in the elites are really going to feel that impact.
So it's very important right now, Mr. Walsh, to closely examine what exactly happened when it comes to the tests and also the launch's nature. What do you think, technically speaking, is the DPRK breaching the earlier commitment? How serious are these launches and tests? Meanwhile, what kinds of capabilities does it show? Is it more a political gesture, a tactical gesture, or is it more a strategic approach? Mr. Walsh, a series of questions, but I hope you will be able to help us to shine some light on them. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Certainly. Well, I think it's not a violation of the commitment. Now, we haven't seen that commitment in writing. That hasn't been released to the public. But the assumption has been that North Korea said, and certainly in most of its actions, that, as you said at the top of the show, would not conduct a nuclear test or a long-range ballistic missile test. And this was not that. So they have not yet violated the commitments that they gave to President Trump. And this is not the first time they've done this. They've also shot off short-range projectiles in the past, at least once before. And then when they get frustrated, they've also sort of, in a very public way, as Jenny knows from the satellite photography that they use at 38 North, sometimes they'll do work at a missile site or they'll do work at a nuclear site to sort of wave a flag and say, hey, we're still here, and we need to make progress. Chairman Kim gave President Trump a end-of-the-year deadline. By the end of 2019, progress had to be made or else. He didn't say what or else was. But I think this is all part of, as you would suggest, political communication. It is signaling, it is pressuring, it is a direct message to President Trump that, if things don't progress, then we'll go back to the bad old days of testing. And I think Jenny is right to point to the importance and the difficult bind that South Korea finds itself in. But these tests only weaken, anytime North Korea does something like this, it only weakens President Moon. It doesn't really help him in his predicament, because domestically he's seen as weak, but he can't make any progress on his inter-Korean relations project as long as the U.S. stands in the way.
Right.
And so it's just bad news for him.
But Mr. Walsh, I want to dig a little bit more about a statement you made that
Sure.
DPRK is giving the United States the end of the year. What is supporting this statement, Mr. Walsh? Which reference are you referring to, the end of the year, so to speak?
Well, I think Kim Jong Un said that in his New Year's speech, or soon afterwards, or maybe it was after Hanoi. But yes, it was the Chairman Kim who had said through KCNA that the clock is ticking here. Now the question is, who's more vulnerable? Who has more leverage here? On the one hand, the North Koreans, as you rightly point out, are facing tough economic and food insecurity problems. On the other hand, the president doesn't want to lose what is essentially his only foreign policy achievement, which is to stop the testing. And so each side is playing this game of chicken. My own preference is that they get back to the negotiating table. And unfortunately, that has yet to happen. We're talking to our allies. we're not, the U.S. and North Korea are the ones who need to be talking.
Okay, and Mr. Yang, you've been listening attentively to your two other colleagues.
Yep.
Now, here's the thing. China, of course, play a big role in terms of trying to make peace on the Korean Peninsula. We're going to talk about that a bit later, but what is your judgment and assessment of the latest situation? Are these all tactical moves by both sides? You heard about the tests and the launches coming from Pyongyang, in which the Chairman Kim personally monitored, according to the latest media report. Certainly that is some kind of gesture when he's personally involved and want to make sure that message is being heard. Meanwhile, Mr. Yang, from Washington's perspective, you heard the other side, together with the allies such as Japan, trying to brush off, saying it is not necessarily significant, the tests recently by the DPRK. So are both sides doing tactical moves and rhetorics for now? Mr. Yang?
I will say by this way, it is a really technical move or technical action, however, containing a strategic signal. Technical action means this test, no matter it's a ballistic missile or something else, the key phrase is the short range. Short range means no violation of any rules or resolutions by UNSC. So no violation, and that is not provocative. However, strategically, the latest intensive military actions, drills, or tests really send a signal indicating Pyongyang is doing or preparing two options. One option is the previous one, say continue to dialogue with the U.S. But on the other hand, start to prepare for the other way. Just like the top leader Kim Jong Un indicated repeatedly, they are trying to seek for the so-called new path. Now, no one understands clearly what does it mean by new path.
Right.
However, the latest tests really indicate something composed for the new path. That means they may return to the previous style of engagement, confrontational engagement with the United States.
Sometimes it's strategically winning in a way,
Yep.
to be vague in terms of the phrase that you use, so that there will always rooms to maneuver, of course, for later use. Mr. Yang, I want to continue to ask you another question. That is, you see about the possibilities between the United States and the DPRK, and yet the timetable, despite of the fact that Mr. Walsh talked about the end of the year as being shown through the DPRK side in the New Year speech, but to what extent, about what, at what time, that timeline, at least to the public, is not known. So what can we understand about the nature of this? Are both sides also having the possibility that they try to show to their domestic constituencies through whether the actions they've taken so far or the rhetorics they've been spreading so far? Remember, President Trump said in his latest tweet, no matter what, he said, a deal will be done. That's what he said. Mr. Yang, your thoughts?
Well, I think both Kim Jong Un and President Trump has been on an irreversible path towards the diplomatic solution on the nuclear issue, especially domestic politics. For Trump, they have input, he has input a lot of political capitals in engaging with Kim Jong Un. And by the same token, Kim Jong Un has input a lot of political capitals to engage with the United States. For example, he has declared no need to more nuclear tests and more ballistic missile tests. And they even removed the nuclear test side. And that situation has made extremely difficulty for Kim Jong Un to return to the previous one. That is why both President Trump and Chairman Kim want to keep the dialogue door open.
Yeah.
So that is the situation. However, for Pyongyang, they said, we can wait till the end of this year. I think that is their true intention. So before end of this year, that's not propaganda. That's
Right.
not tactics. That's a true intention. Say, before end of this year, it's worse for Pyongyang to wait for the opportunity of resuming dialogues.
Right.
For the next year, for Pyongyang's calculation, U.S. will fall in a mass presidential campaign,
right,
and a lot of uncertainties. At that time, it's no worth talking with the existing president. So I think the time window of opportunity window
is short.
Is short.
Probably
yeah.
it is at the end of the year, before the end of the year. Ms. Tao, I want to go to you about that too, about the timing and about the time schedule that the two sides have to, at least in the hearts, come up with something, if not in paper, showing to the public. Ms. Tao.
Yeah, I think as much as Kim Jong Un has said he would give the U.S. until the end of the year to come to the strategic decision on the U.S. DPRK side of the equation, the problem is I think our timetable is actually much shorter. What North Korea has done now by doing these series of short-range tests that they've done over the past few weeks now, and sort of the missives that they've given towards Seoul. The problem is now is that this is all it makes it very difficult now for South Korea to justify continuing to postpone military exercises, the joint military exercises. And so I think if we go back to the Ulchi Freedom Guardian the way that it was done in the past, back in 2017, for instance, this summer, it's going to reverse a lot of the political goodwill and a lot of the intention to move forward. It's going to reverse a lot of that.
A path that had been traveled earlier may not be the path that can be taken anymore as circumstances are changing. It seems that you're suggesting that is now. But I want to further ask you a question related to that, which is what Mr. Walsh mentioned in his statement earlier, which I think is extremely interesting and intellectually discussable. That is whether both sides are matching or measuring each other's capability of leveraging. Because we all know, of course, in a negotiation, the more you can leverage, the better. However, in a negotiation, it is also true if both sides have one common goal, there could be differences in the capabilities of leveraging. But as long as they have a common goal, both sides will work toward that, despite of the fact they have different capabilities. And eventually, nobody would feel losing out in that negotiation, and most likely, that common goal will be achieved. Now, here's the thing, Ms. Tao. Whether the two sides are still trying to measure their leverage capabilities toward one another, or they are willing to work toward a common goal, I think that is the issue here. That is what we are really talking about. Ms. Tao.
Well, I don't think they necessarily have the same common goal. What we saw in Singapore, for instance, the agenda that they laid out, there are different priorities within that. And I think, the North Koreans prioritize the relationship, the peace agenda, the removal of hostile policy, whereas the U.S. is emphasizing the denuclearization side of stuff. So because of that, I think there's a lot of miscalculation going on. And I think, what the North Koreans are doing now, as much as I think they believe that it builds their leverage against South Korea and against the U.S. by challenging them to, not go back to the relationship they had before. In fact, it pushes them in the wrong direction because, again, it makes it very difficult for either side to justify continuing an air of good political goodwill as they move forward, even though they've invested so much capital in it.
So, Mr. Yang, so the two sides do have huge difference in terms of what the goals, the ultimate goals are, or at least the combinations of goals are. Mr. Yang, do you agree with that?
No, I prefer looking the difference at this way.
Okay.
At the level of ultimate goal, no difference. They have got consensus say full denuclearization. Both Singapore meeting and the Hanoi meeting repeat this consensus.
All right.
And the difference lies in the approach or the path. I summarized the different paths for North Korea and the U.S. at this way. For the United States, declaration first, verification second, and the dismantlement third, lastly. And so the 3 steps. For North Korea, freeze first, reducing the capability second,
Right.
and dismantlement the last. So the last one, the 3 steps, they totally different, but the last one is the same, dismantlement versus dismantlement. But starting from the freeze or starting from the declaration,
Right.
that is quite a substantive. That's not a technical issue. It's a political and a strategic and a security issue. For North Korea, they argued, we are remain in the state of war, we are remain in the relationship of enemy.
Right.
How I can declare our top secret, how many warheads, how many materials we have?
So here is the thing, Mr. Walsh. You listen to your 2 colleagues. It's a matter of fact, okay, that both sides talk about the denuclearization. That's true of the Korean Peninsula. But the approach they're taking is certainly different. And the approach is not just the approach itself, but rather strategy and the end goal in a way as well. So, Mr. Walsh, is now a reflection of this huge difference in nature to begin with the latest tension. Meanwhile, will both sides be able and afford to adjust the so-called approach differences as time goes on, when U.S. is running into really big political season in which the DPRK issue could be a big political capital for President Trump to seek re-election politically, and also in the DPRK, if you see the situation, drought, poverty, and other issues continue for the stability of the governance. Mr. Walsh.
Well, I guess my short answer to both your questions is yes. Yes, this moment in time does reflect the differences the 2 sides have. Just to give an illustration, another illustration, the U.S. continues to emphasize economic benefits for North Korea. The president did this in his tweet. You know, you'll be rich and fat and happy, but that doesn't address North Korea's security concerns. And we know from the Putin summit, Kim Putin summit, there has to be a way to address, if North Korea were to disarm and be left defenseless, what guarantee would it have that it would survive as a country? So the U.S. has not been very good about talking about the security side of the equation. You are absolutely right again, yes, that this moment reflects that, and that going forward there's a real question here. So the North Koreans have sort of pulled back, which is their way after Hanoi. That was to be expected.
Yeah.
But they also seem to have a different strategy. Their strategy was sort of get Trump in the room, deal with him one-on-one, don't go through all these working groups and all the rest of it. You know, get him in a room and get him to sign on to a good agreement. And that didn't work in Hanoi. And so both sides, and frankly, the U.S. hasn't been very good about pressing for negotiations. I mean, after Singapore, you know, nothing happened. And now after Hanoi, nothing's happened. They have to meet, you know, in Geneva, in Beijing, they have to do the dirty work, the hard work of diplomacy, and as you suggested,
very interesting.
It has to start sooner rather than later.
What you're saying,
it has to start now.
Those things that have not been done will always come back and haunt us, don't they? And they are right now. So, Mr. Yang, go to you very briefly, of course, before the other 2 guests. What can be done, and what can the other parties do? And what should be the DPRK and Washington be able to respond to the latest increasing tension, at least apparently, Mr. Yang? Very briefly, an answer from you, sir.
Well, resuming the talks without any preconditions for exploring mutually accepted compromise about the differences I mentioned above.
But how? I mean, how would they be able to resume a dialogue when you are having tensions like this, the tests and the Twitter and the tests more and the Twitter more? So I don't see the possibility. Mr. Yang, I could borrow some wisdom from you very briefly, sir, once again.
Well, dialogues will provide the opportunities to find a compromising way. By the air exchanges, no way to find a solution.
I see. And Mr. Walsh, you got some positive wisdom for us too?
I think Mr. Young's wisdom is good enough for me. They need to sit in a room and negotiate. Now, you say there are problems in the relationship. Yes, there are always problems in a relationship when adversaries, enemies, are trying to sit down and negotiate. That's just the way it is. And so they're going to have to ignore that and do the hard work of diplomacy. So I'm with Mr. Young on this.
All right. And Ms. Tao?
Well, I mean, that is exactly the goal of diplomacy, is to be able to talk about the hard issues and reduce tensions. The problem, I think, that really lies at the heart of this is that in the U.S. approach to this issue, again, while we have a new approach, we have Trump negotiating one-on-one with Kim Jong Un, the problem is we keep coming back with the same old proposition. And until the U.S. is ready to actually accept a different approach, one that does take into consideration the security concerns, that does take the time to build the relationship of trust while we're working towards denuclearization.
Right.
As long as we continue this all-or-nothing approach, we're not going to get very far, and the North Koreans aren't going to come back to the table. So I think, we really need to come to terms with what it is that is in the U.S. best interest, and if that is denuclearization, there is a path towards denuclearization, but it means that we have to accept a different approach to it as well, and we're not going to get all of it up front.
You know what? When it comes to real world, wishful thinking never gets us there. There has to be a lot of hard work and sometimes compromise. No matter how difficult they are, they always eventually serve a much bigger and better purpose. For now, I want to thank the three of you. I mean, I've been having you guys on the program over and over again at very difficult and critical times of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, and every time talking to you, there's certainly wisdom that can be learned. Thank you once again for your insights. XIYU, Jenny Tao, last but not least, Jim Walsh. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.